Thanks for stopping by my channel today. I am Nicole Frolick of Inflexible Me, and today we're going to be talking about how your energetic field, your electromagnetic field, is affected by your level of consciousness and how your level of consciousness is manipulated through your emotions. We're going to talk about mind control, and we're also going to talk about pineal power, because I've been getting a lot of requests for more information on the pineal gland. But before we get into that, I think it's really important to understand how our level of consciousness can really affect the collective human consciousness. And so I'm going to talk to you today about the idea of levels of consciousness based on the book Power versus Force by David Hawkins. And this book was introduced to me when I was about 21, 22, so in the mid late 90s. And it was really one of the most powerful books I read, especially at that time, to really understand how we create our reality through whatever level of consciousness we're at. So we're going to talk a bit about that first, so you get the foundations and you understand how you can positively impact other people's consciousness just through working on your own, but also you understand how your own consciousness can be impacted if you're not conscious enough about what's going on around you, especially if it's in a lower vibration, more negativity. Okay, so these levels of consciousness are kind of based on our attitudes and our emotions. And the way that they move up in levels is through a logarithmic progression, which means that as you go higher up in the levels, it's not just simple arithmetic, whereas like if you're jumping from 150 to 200, you've gained 50 points. It's actually to the 10th power. So which means you're going to make leaps of power every time you move up a level. So understanding these levels of consciousness is really important to determine where our thoughts are coming from, our actions, and our feelings. And as we know, our feelings are the engine behind everything manifesting in front of us. It's important to understand these levels of consciousness that we're going to be talking about today, because in this book, Power versus Force, the levels are that anything below 200, so anything below the level of 200 is considered to be a destructive expression of power. And anything that's above 200 is meant to be a constructive expression of power. So when we go through these levels of consciousness, it's important to note that anything that's going to be below 200 is not constructive for us in a human collective of where we want to go. It's in the more negative zone, and we want to try and obviously be up more in the positive zone. So according to this book, Power versus Force, the lowest level of consciousness right before death is shame, and it sits at the level of 20. Now, shame is a really interesting emotion and attitude to have, especially at this current time where we're at globally, because this is something we have to really be aware of. Shame is a big one, because when you are having a different belief from someone else, you have different concepts, different ideas, and if you're in the minority and you're not in the majority of how that thought process is, then you're gonna come up against a lot of resistance. And what I've seen happen, and it's happened to me earlier this year, I was on the recipient end of being shamed, was because I had a different belief or outlook or perception on what was going on in the world. And when I voiced it, I was met with two different attitudes. One, I was overwhelmed by an inpouring of support behind the scenes, so through direct message. It seemed that people didn't want to show their support on the outside out of fear for this very same thing that was happening to me of being judged. So there was the support coming on the inside, but however, there was a lot of resistance and judgment that came on the outside from the people who couldn't believe that I had certain ideas or concepts or perceptions of what was going on. And there was a lot of outrage from family, friends, people that I just know, acquaintances. And it was actually a really interesting experiment, although it wasn't an experiment that I did. But when I look at it, it was, in hindsight, it was very interesting because when I didn't agree with someone that absolutely to their core believed they were right and I was wrong, they would try to persuade me to see their side until I believed them. And if I really didn't believe them and just said, it's okay, you can have your thoughts, I'm going to have mine, we're good. And that didn't work well. That didn't go over so well. So once they realized that they couldn't persuade me to see their perspective or see it their way and leave my beliefs to the side, then shame was used. And I was shamed into believing that I was less than because I had these perspectives. And it was interesting to see how people's worlds get rocked when something that they believe to their core isn't agreed upon. So shame, being such a lower vibration frequency and being so close to death, is a really scary place to be in vibrationally. So we don't want anyone to be feeling shame. Like that is not something where we want to be putting out to the world, and it's certainly something we don't want to be accepting. So I had to work really hard to make sure that whatever people were trying to project onto me was their stuff and I wasn't taking it on. So when you're the recipient of shame, it's really important to do that. Now, if you are the person who's projecting the shame onto someone, keep in mind that although you may be shaming someone else, you're actually shaming yourself, because we're all connected. When what we do to one is doing the same to us, it's all reflective, it's all a mirror. Now, you're only hurting yourself, which means you've taken your frequency and brought it down into shame as well. And that's not a good place for you to be in. No one should be there. None of us should be. So I just wanted to really briefly talk about that, because there's a lot of that going on in the world right now. There's a lot of pointing the finger. There's a lot of name calling, and there's a lot of labeling. And it is not good for anyone. It's not good for the people who are pointing the finger, and it's not good for the people who are the recipients of this judgment. So shame number 20. Okay, then you move up to guilt, apathy, and grief. So as you can see, guilt is at the level 30, apathy is at 50, and then grief you move up into 75. So you're starting to move up in levels of consciousness, but these are not, again, great levels to be at. So then we move into one of our big ones, fear. Now, fear sits at the level of 100. And fear is used a lot to manipulate us. It's used in news, it's used in TV shows, it's used in movies, it's used in books, it's used in advertising, it's used all around us. And it's used to manipulate us to get a certain outcome. Now, what Dr. Hawkins says about fear: fear is the favored official tool for control by oppressive totalitarian agencies and regimes, and insecurity is the stock in trade of major manipulators of the marketplace. The media and advertising play to fear to increase market share. So this is huge. And I think it's quite obvious when you take a step back and you look at it from a very objective point of view. You remove all your emotions and you can see when your emotions are being played on, and fear is a big one that gets us down. Now, this is one of the reasons why I really don't watch a lot of news, and if I do, it's certainly not on the mainstream right now, because for the most part, most of the mainstream media is fear-based, and it's also the same in alternative news, so beware of that as well. I've seen alternative news use fear in the same way, and it's not beneficial. Even if the message is, or the information is positive, the delivery method, the energy behind it, is taking you down. So you just want to try to avoid all of that. So fear is really important to understand that that is a level of consciousness that sits at 100. So after fear, we move into desire. Now, desire sits at the level 125. And desire comes from our ego. It's where, we are in seek of things, accumulating things. It's associated with greed. This is that lower level vibration of pleasure. It's not the higher vibration levels of pleasure. And desire is also associated with addiction. So addiction occurs in this consciousness level of desire. After desire, we move up to 150, which is anger. What Dr. Hawkins says about power is this: anger as a lifestyle is exemplified by irritable, explosive people who are oversensitive to slights and become injustice collectors, quarrelsome, belligerent, or litigious. Okay, so I think it's safe to say that we are seeing a lot of anger out there right now. Just a little touch on this topic because it's rampant right now in our world, at least when you see it portrayed on the news. When you are going to protest, if there's something you are in disagreement with, you really feel in your core that it's not right, I support anyone fighting for what they believe in. But when you're fighting for something you believe in, it's really important to understand where your energy is coming from. Being outraged and being angry is okay. These are emotions that we're going to feel. We're human. But you don't want to try and make change from that level, because all you're going to be doing is injecting more of that level of consciousness into the outcome that you're trying to get, which is never going to happen. So if you're trying to fight for a more peaceful outcome, but you're going at it with all this anger behind you, well, then you're never, ever going to reach peace, which we'll talk about later is a much, much higher level of consciousness. So when we see all these protests, whether you see them on the news, other sources of information, I've witnessed where there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of hatred coming out, and these all stem from anger. So it's important that if you are participating in anything that is trying to see change to get a different outcome that is hopefully more positive, check where you're coming from. Don't worry about where anyone else is coming from outside of yourself. Just check where you're coming from, because that's who you have control over. And make sure that whatever energy you're bringing to the table, it's not below this 200 level, and anger is certainly below the 200. After anger, we move up into pride. And pride is also not the greatest thing, but it's certainly better than anger, as you can see. And then after pride, we move into the 200 baseline, and it's courage. Courage is the marker point where there is positive growth starting to happen. Instead of constriction, we're now seeing growth within someone. Someone's wanting to see a little bit of change. They're willing to stand up for themselves. It's the first level of empowerment. When you're in the level of courage and you have obstacles in your life, you no longer look at those as deterrents. You look at them as stimulants for growth. Okay, so that's the level of courage. So once we get up to the 200 level, that's when all the growth starts to happen. After courage, we have neutralities, which is level 250. So this is really cool because now you're not so much working in polarization. You're not polarized to one side or the other. You're willing to kind of stay in the middle of the road, which, some people look as like, you got to take sides, but not really. What's so wrong with being in the middle so that you can see both sides? This is where this is the vantage point of being neutral, is that you get to see both sides evenly. And we have a lot to learn from all sides. There's never going to be one side that's right and another side that's more wrong. There's always things to learn. And whether it's looking into different beliefs or ideas, then I think it's important to understand that when you are willing to see the other side, there is something that you might be able to see in a different way. And that's growth. So we're all for that. After neutrality, we move up to willingness, which is the level 310. And this expression of consciousness is when people want to succeed. They want to do better in their lives. So when you're at this 310 level, you're going to try a little harder. You want to put more effort into things for a better outcome. After willingness, we move up to acceptance, and that's 350. Now, I've done a blog on acceptance, so I'm going to leave a link below, and at the end you can also click on the blog in this video. But I did a blog called acceptance is not passivity. And a lot of people seem to think that when you're accepting things, you're just rolling over and allowing it to happen to you, and you have no control. You've lost all control, and you're giving up. You're waving the proverbial white flag, and that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, acceptance is a state of empowerment. You are now, instead of resisting what life's throwing your way, you're now allowing yourself to engage in it. And engagement is a really powerful tool when you want to move forward in life. When you're resisting something, you're stagnant. You're not going anywhere, and all your energy is used into pushing back on this force. However, when you accept something, you now are allowing yourself to engage it in a different way. And this is super empowering, because when you're allowed to engage in a different way, now you're open to maybe new solutions, things that you weren't able to see before. Perhaps you now have a different perspective, and the very thing that you were resisting is actually a blessing in disguise. So acceptance is a really good level of being at. As you can see, we're already at 350. Okay, the next level is reason, which is at the level 400. Now, this is where intelligence and rationality come in. This is where science resides. And I know I've got some friends who are all about science, and hey, I love science too. It was my favorite subject, but let's face it, science does not have all the answers. So what David says about reason is this: reason does not of itself provide a guide to truth. It produces massive amounts of information and documentation, but lacks the capability to resolve discrepancies in data and conclusions. All philosophic arguments sound convincing on their own. Although reason is highly effective in a technical world where the methodologies of logic dominate, reason itself, paradoxically, is the major block to reaching higher levels of consciousness. Transcending this level is relatively uncommon and has only been done by about 4% of the world's population. Now, that's interesting. Well, first of all, it explains a lot as to why people get stuck in the answers of what science can prove. If you're one of those people who's like, well, prove it, prove it. Well, science isn't the be all and end all of truth, as David clearly states in that last comment. Spirituality, the answers that come forth as you start to expand your consciousness come from beyond science. If science is resonating at 400, then anytime you move your frequency to a higher level of 400 and beyond, you are now tapping into that much higher expanded consciousness, which means you're tapping into divine source energy. You are now tapping into the information that comes from the all-knowing. And science has not yet figured out how to do that just by the very design of how it's done. It was created by humans. It was not created by source energy. So reason is good though, because it's important to have information. It's important to collect information and then look at that information. You can review it, you can analyze it, you can do all these things that you need to do to see if it makes sense and grow through intelligence, gaining more knowledge. But it's also one of the layers in your tool of discernment. And discernment is huge, especially when we're trying to understand what's going on around us and understanding these levels of consciousness. The other level of discernment comes from what we're talking about right now, these levels of consciousness and the feelings that are kind of in alignment with them. So when you're trying to discern truth, what level, this is a good question to ask, what level of consciousness is it resonating at for you? When you read something, is its truth resonating in fear, which is below 200, or is its truth resonating in something higher, like say acceptance? But understanding where this truth is resonating at, what does it feel like, is going to be a very powerful tool for you in understanding your discernment when you're trying to figure out the information. Is this true? Is this not? Does this make sense? That's a really powerful tool to have in your toolbox. So keep that in mind when trying to discern truth. So after reason, we come up to the big one, the big 500, and it's love. But not love in the way that everyone in the world pretty much thinks love is, because most of the world thinks love is crap. We have a very tainted version or perspective on love, and that actually isn't what love is, and that's not the kind of love that this 500 level is talking about. The tainted version will lead to jealousy, will lead to resentment. There are no expectations in this level of love. It's unconditional, it is permanent, and it is unchanging. When this book was published, it said that there was only 4% of the world resonating at love. And this unconditional love, which leads into joy, which is 540, that's the next level, that only 0.4% of the world is actually resonating at that. Now, I'm going to be the optimist, but this is truly what I believe. I believe that where we are right now, because this is like over a decade from when this book was last published, I truly believe, just from what I'm seeing and the level of consciousness that out there, that there are many more people, that is a higher percentage, that are starting to resonate in this frequency. So don't feel like disempowered that, oh my gosh, there's like the most smallest fraction of people at this frequency, because I believe it's higher, but also what I'm going to tell you later on is going to give you a little bit more hope as to why that actually isn't necessarily so bad. But first, let's talk about joy. Joy is where unconditional love is rooting from. So, or I should say, joy is born through this unconditional love. The more unconditional love you have, the more joy you're going to create. And compassion is one of the main traits of this level of consciousness. At this level, there are usually many healing and spiritual groups. And this is also when when you're resonating at this frequency of joy, this is when you're in your flow. This is when you look around and there are so many synchronicities happening around you, and you're living through those synchronicities. Like, they're guiding you, they're happening all the time. Manifestation is coming with ease. This is a really good frequency to be at, especially when we're trying to create a better world. So what David Hawkins says about joy is, everything happens effortlessly by synchronicity, and the world and everything in it is seen to be an expression of love and divinity. Joy is awesome. I've had the blessing of feeling joy for months at a time. I didn't know it was possible. It literally felt like every cell in my body was jumping up and down with childlike wonderment and joy. And it's a pretty incredible state to be in. So it doesn't mean, now when I talk about these levels of consciousness, it doesn't mean that once you get to one level, you never fall back down to another. In fact, you can actually be resonating in different levels of consciousness at the same time, depending on what area of your life it's in. So for instance, maybe you're in a higher level of consciousness with your work, but in your relationships, it's not that level. So it could be different that way. And also, just on a general level, we can be taken out of these consciousness levels and brought down really low by what we're surrounding ourselves with. So what we're taking into our energy field. So it's really important that, you can fluctuate between these levels, but the idea is that we do want to work up so that we're resonating higher and higher and can maintain it for longer periods of time, so that when we do fall low, we are more likely to pick ourselves up quicker and get back into the higher levels. Again, we're all human, so it's going to happen. Don't be hard on yourself if it does. I've been there. It can sometimes suck when that happens because it is such a good place to be when you are in those higher levels. And when you go back down to those levels of anger or fear, things like that, man, it sucks. But allow yourself to be there. We're here to feel things and work things through, so it's all good. Now, after joy comes peace. Now, that's the one I talked about. If you're protesting for peace, as you can see, peace resonates at 600. It is one of the highest levels of consciousness. So if you're wanting to create peace in this world, you got to get your consciousness level up. It all depends on you. And when I say that, I'm being absolutely serious because your world is created by you and everything around you will be affected. So you actually have more control than you think. And then after peace, we have enlightenment, which is from 700 to 1,000. And enlightenment is where we had our great masters of the world, Jesus, Buddha. That's the state of enlightenment that very few have reached according to this book. But I do believe this is where everyone is working towards if you're working on the ascension process. If you don't know what the ascension process is, Google it. You're going to find lots of information. But for all of you out there who do know, this is the state that we're all working towards. And it's about raising into that higher level of consciousness, that higher level of frequency, getting our vibes really high so that we are no longer dipping into that lower frequencies. Okay, so now that we know what all the levels of consciousness are, I want to talk about one thing because it can get misinterpreted, and this happens a lot. Whereas if you want to be in your joy and you want to get in that place of joy and do something that brings you joy, a lot of people may think that some people question activities that may not be considered positive, but that person gets joy out of it. So is that really a state of joy? How can joy be at such a high level? Okay, that is not the case. There is a huge difference between satisfaction and pure joy. Satisfaction can come from the desires that resonate in the lower frequency. So as you know, desire is actually lower than anger. So when we're operating from the ego and we're trying to get our pleasures from a very egotistical place and you feel good, those pleasures that you're feeling are rooted in desire. They are not rooted in the joy that I'm talking about that resonates at 540. So very important to keep in mind, joy is coming from a pure place. Satisfaction or that pleasure that's rooted in desire is not. So it's very important to understand that difference because I get that question a lot. People ask me about that, and so I just wanted to clear that one up. Okay, so now that we know all the levels of consciousness, how do we take this knowing and this understanding and apply it for good within the human collective? Like, what does this mean for the human collective in a positive way? Or how is it used against us in, for instance, mind control? So mind control happens when you're constantly allowing yourself to be in that lower consciousness level. So all those levels of from basically anger, fear, desire, apathy, guilt, shame, any of those ones that are discussed and any of the other ones that I haven't mentioned, when you are allowing yourself to be bombarded with those kind of energies, you are allowing yourself to be brought down energetically into those lower levels of consciousness, whether you realize it or not. And this is actually used against us, like I said, in TV, in movies, in books, in advertising, all of it and more. Okay, so it's really important to understand if you can see what happens how you're going to create your world. Where we create our world from is where our level of consciousness is. So if you really want to be creating something that is empowering to you, then you cannot be allowed to be taken down to these lower levels of consciousness. Now, not everyone is able to understand this concept, especially when you're in the lower levels of consciousness. You don't have that desire or that willingness that's a higher one to grow, to understand more, to challenge things. Yeah, you're too caught up in your emotions of anger and fear and resentment and judgment and shame to be bothered with all of that. You just want to change it from your emotions, but that's not constructive. So how do we as a collective work together to bring up the level of consciousness and help those who are maybe stuck in the lower levels and can't get out, but don't know how to get out? Because it is hard. I mean, for me personally, if I've ever been in a lower state, like depressed, sad, any of that, it's hard sometimes to get yourself out of there. So, no judgment on anyone who's there. No judgment at all. We've all been there, and we're probably all going to get there again at some point. But how do we use our pineal power to help the collective? Now, this is where our beloved pineal gland comes in. As you can see that right here, I'm showing you that one individual who resonates at a frequency higher than 200 can affect many more people that are in below 200. So if you're someone who's resonating in the 300 level of consciousness, you are going to be able to counterbalance the energy that's below 200, all of that energy, all those individuals who are resonating below 200, 90,000 individuals. One person can have that effect to counterbalance that energy. Now, the even more incredible aspect of this is what happens if you're someone who's resonating higher than 300? So if someone at 300 can affect and counterbalance the negative energy of 90,000 people, 400, someone resonating at the level of 400 has the ability to counterbalance the negativity of 400,000 individuals below the consciousness level of 200. Do you see the jump? Do you see the increase in power? This is what I was talking about earlier it's a logarithmic progression. So as you raise your consciousness, you're not just going up in certain levels of simple arithmetic of adding, it's not like that. It's exponential growth. You're making huge leaps of power. So every time you raise your vibrations, you have the ability to positively balance out the negativity in a vast amount of people. All the way up to someone who's resonating at 700 can counterbalance 70 million individuals. That is incredible. And this whole purpose of group meditations, if you took part in the unity meditation on the solar eclipse that happened, we had a 250,000 people focusing on peace, focusing on love, focusing on joy for 15 minutes. Those are all super high levels of consciousness. Now, when you have more pineal glands all focusing on the same concept or idea, the same energetic level, the pineal glands actually become more empowered. It's like their metaphysical power just jumps. It takes off. It's like it goes on steroids or something. And so when you have a collective, the more people you have in group meditation, meditating on really positive outcomes, this is the power behind that. You are not just one person trying to affect one other person. You are one person who could effectively be assisting 70 million people at once. That is power. That is true power. It is not the force power that we think comes from the lower energies where someone has power over you. No, this is true power. This is empowerment. And so this is so huge in understanding your individual power and how you can make a change in this world. We all think that we're one person and we can't really do much, but I'm showing you that this is not the case. And this information is so important for everyone to know, especially if you are involved in trying to bring a bigger outcome, a better outcome, a more positive outcome into this world. So when you go into meditation, you are connecting to a common energetic field or level with other people that are doing this group meditation with you. And so now, if you happen to be a group that is, say you are a group of 10 people, and you're all resonating at 700, which would be amazing. It's a really high frequency. This is our frequency of enlightenment. But let's just say, for the sake of numbers and understanding, 10 people at 700, each person is going to affect 70 million people. And that's change. That's power. And you're helping to empower others to move up. We need to have the compassion for those that may not understand or have the awareness of what's going on around them to be able to take themselves out of these lower vibrational energies and assist them in any way we can, because the reality is that they are us and we are them. So this whole law of oneness is really important to understand, that when we help ourselves, we're helping others, and when we help others, we are also helping ourselves. It is all synchronized, it is all interchangeable, it is all working together. So this is kind of one of I know it's a long one today, but I thought it was really important to understand the levels of consciousness, so that when I come into future video series going forward, that you're really going to understand the power behind your consciousness, the power behind your pineal gland, and the power that you as an individual have on the collective. It is not small. It is not small by any chance. So if you want to learn more on my blog of acceptance, you can go to you can click on this guy here on my blog of acceptance. And if you want to learn more about love, because I've talked about love with my co-hosts on my podcast Enlighten Up, about what love actually is, and it's called The Love Conspiracy, and it's episode number 6. So if you want to listen to that, you can click here as well. And thanks for joining me today. I really love having you over here, and I love sharing this information. If you think it's helpful, please share it as well with anyone that you know. If you like this episode, please hit like and share the love. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do, so I can keep you up to date on any new videos coming out. And of course, if you want to get more information on me, you can also go to my website, inflexibleme.com. I also have a newsletter there, so when I do anything that comes out, any events, any blogs or vlogs, I'm always updating through that newsletter. And so you can go on over to inflexibleme.com and hit subscribe on the homepage. So thanks again for joining me today. I will be back with you guys very soon.